Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Monday, the 11th of August. I'm Stephen Carroll in London. Coming up today, Nvidia and AMD agree to pay the United States 15% of their China AI chip revenue to secure export licenses to the country. The head of NATO says Ukrainian land will have to be on the table in any peace deal with Russia. Plus, crumbling dreams. Germany's property collapse exposes pension funds to risky private credit losses. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. Bloomberg understands that Nvidia and AMD have agreed to pay 15% of their revenues from Chinese AI chip sales to the US government in a deal to secure export licenses to the country. The highly unusual arrangement reflects President Trump's effort to engineer a financial payout for America in return for concessions on trade. Our China correspondent Min Min Lo has more.
This is something quite unprecedented because no U.S. company has done this before. It does give us a new precedent for the type of compliance costs that companies could face as they do business with China. It also raises the question as to whether or not the U.S. is willing to trade off some of these security concerns by rolling back even more of these export controls in exchange for a cut of the revenue from U.S. companies.
Min Min Lo speaking there with less than 24 hours to go until the US-China trade truce expires. The Trump administration has previously signalled that the agreement is likely to be extended. In its Truth Social post overnight, the US president called on Beijing to quadruple its soybean orders to reduce China's trade deficit with America. NATO's Secretary-General Mark Rutte says this Friday's summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin may open the door to negotiations over Ukrainian territory. President Zelensky has continued to reject the idea of ceding land currently occupied by Russia. Speaking to ABC's This Week, Rutte says Kyiv may have to accept that it has lost control of some of its territory without formally relinquishing sovereignty.
These two big issues have to be on the table. One is territory, and we have to acknowledge at this moment that Russia is controlling some of Ukrainian territory. And the question will be how to go forward past a ceasefire, including what it means in terms of security guarantees for Ukraine.
NATO chief Mark Rutte spoke to ABC's This Week as Bloomberg learned that European leaders have been seeking to talk to Trump ahead of his meeting with Putin. Ukraine and its European allies have been pushing for a ceasefire that freezes the current front line as a first step towards negotiations on a more lasting settlement. Israel's Prime Minister has defended his widely condemned plans for a military sweep against Hamas strongholds in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu described the proposal as the best available option for recovering the country's hostages and safeguarding its security.
Given Hamas's refusal to lay down its arms, Israel has no choice but to finish the job and complete the defeat of Hamas. Contrary to false claims, this is the best way to end the war and the best way to end it speedily.
Benjamin Netanyahu's plans have been criticised at home and by foreign leaders, dozens of whom have spoken out against the humanitarian crisis in Gaza after Israel cut off aid between March and May. Australia has become the latest country to announce it will recognise a Palestinian state at the United Nations General Assembly meeting in September. The news comes as London's Metropolitan Police say 532 people were arrested during a demonstration on Saturday for supporting banned group Palestine Action. Al Jazeera says 5 of its journalists were killed when an Israeli airstrike hit a tent in Gaza on Sunday. The news organisation reported the deaths of 2 correspondents and cameramen close to Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital in what it called a targeted assassination. The Israeli military confirmed it had targeted Al Jazeera correspondent Anas al-Sharif, claiming on Telegram that he had served as the head of a terrorist cell in Hamas. The Committee to Protect Journalists told the BBC that Israel has so far failed to provide evidence to back up the allegation that the journalists they killed were terrorists. The UK's jobs market is weakening as employers hold back due to fears around taxes and an uncertain future. A poll by KPMG and the Recruitment and Employment Confederation showed starting salaries rising at the slowest pace in over 4 years. Bloomberg's James Wilcock has more.
Working people are seeing fewer pay rises. The KPMG REC survey is stark. It shows a sharp slowdown in hiring, low wages and pessimism about the future. And with tomorrow's official UK jobs data being seen as less reliable, the REC release has become a closely watched indicator for the Bank of England. Companies blame a wall of global uncertainty for the pullback, but they point their finger at the Labour government too, singling out higher payroll taxes, coming tough employment laws, and the fear of more taxes potentially headed their way this autumn as key reasons for holding back. In London, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
Economists expect the European Central Bank to hold interest rates steady until December. A Bloomberg survey says central bank watchers are pushing back expectations for more rate cuts while they wait to see the impact of the global trade tariffs. Global peers also show signs of taking a while to determine their next move, with the Federal Reserve having stayed on hold so far this year, and the Bank of England governor last week acknowledging genuine uncertainty. And those are your top stories on the markets. The MSCI Asia Pacific Index outside of Japan is up by 0.4% this morning. Japanese markets are closed for a holiday. Euro Stoxx 50 futures are up by 0.2. S&P E-minis on Wall Street are up by 0.1. Oil prices are lower by 0.6%, with Friday's meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in focus. The Brent crude trading at $66.21. Soybean futures have risen on that social media post from Donald Trump calling on China to buy more. They're up about 2.3%. And Bitcoin close to a record high, $122,000 just over per digital token at the moment. In a moment, we'll bring you more on that deal between chipmakers and the US government to get export licenses to China. Plus, we'll have a story about how small pension funds in Germany are feeling the pain from the property market crash there. But another story that I've been reading this week, and on teaching your children to play poker. Apparently, it's easy, or so says Matt Levine anyway. If you're looking for something to do on your family holiday this summer, perhaps you can try it out. His essay is about teaching his 8-year-old daughter and 4-year-old twins to play poker. Now, his strategy is you start with one card, which introduces the whole concept of betting and bluffing, and that it doesn't matter essentially what cards you're dealt, it's what you do with them. And he says that's a much easier concept to get across than trying to get someone to learn off, you know, whether a flush is better than a straight flush or so on and so forth. So his strategy says that once your kids have mastered this, you can then make things more complicated, make it a two-card game, then a 5-card, and so on. He writes about it very well, and I think it's a lovely piece also about getting his children on board with something that he's interested in too. I do wonder if it depends on the temperament of your children, though. It's definitely a step up from Monopoly games that I was playing with my family as a child anyway. But it's a great read. You'll find it on Bloomberg.com. We'll put a link to it in our podcast show notes as well. Let's turn, though, back to our top story. Nvidia and AMD agreeing to pay 15% of their revenues from Chinese AI chip sales to the US government to secure export licenses. Our tech editor, Vlad Savov, is with me now for more. Vlad, what can you tell us then about this agreement that Nvidia and AMD were told have signed up to?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, it's worth taking a step back to understand what band they were trying to get over, because as of April this year, these chips that we're talking about, in Nvidia's case, the H20 chips that it had initially designed specifically for China and was shipping and selling over there, that's when the Trump administration decided that they will be caught up in its limits on shipments to China. So this limitation on Nvidia and AMD shipments to the country didn't exist until April. That's when the Trump administration imposed them. And from our reporting, what we understand is it was as straightforward as saying, the Trump administration saying to Nvidia and AMD, if you give us 15% of the proceeds, you will be allowed to ship those again.
Okay, so, I mean, how valuable are these chip sales to these companies that they'd be willing to do this?
Well, if you listen to Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang, he's made this case very strongly and very consistently that if Nvidia is not present in China, that costs US interest. Obviously, it costs Nvidia's own interest, but his case is more nuanced. He's saying that he can both serve China's interests by providing them AI accelerators, which his company is the leader in manufacturing those, but he can also serve US interests by getting China attached to the US, as he calls it, technology stack, right? So what Nvidia sells isn't just the GPU or the hardware or the accelerator. It also sells the connective tissue. It sells the infrastructure that goes into all these data centers. Nvidia even likes to talk about so-called AI factories, which really are just data centers full of Nvidia hardware. And Jensen Huang's premise is, if you get all of China, when you're talking about the ByteDance, Tencent, Alibabas of the world, building their data centers around NVIDIA hardware, that is geopolitically, strategically advantageous for the US, because it means that the US has more negotiating leverage in future negotiations. It means the US still has some sort of influence over China. And, you know, the idea is that if there is no US tech allowed in there, China will not just say, we're not interested in AI anymore because we don't have access. They'll build their own.
So what does this mean then for the tech industry more broadly, that companies as big as Nvidia and AMD would sign up to something like this?
Well, again, you kind of have to rewind a little bit. When you look back to the end of January, when the TikTok ban in the US was just about to happen, and then Donald Trump started a series of extensions to that deadline, one of the things that he made really clear is that everything is on the negotiating table with his administration. Up until that point, it was all built on national security grounds. It was TikTok's US operations cannot operate here because they have access to young Americans' personal information, which Donald Trump literally shrugged off in the White House. He said, what's the big deal? It's just kids' information. So he was making the point then that TikTok could be as big as a $1 trillion business, and the US should have a slice of that. And really what we're seeing now with this deal with Nvidia and AMD is the actual manifestation of what he envisions. It's, we're going to strike a deal, you literally give us a cut of the sales, and then you go ahead and proceed.
Okay. Vlad, thanks very much for joining us with the latest on that story. That's our tech editor, Vlad Savov there. Well, to Germany now, where the commercial property bubble that burst under higher interest rates is continuing to cause pain. Small pension funds that had helped to finance major projects when rates were near zero are now proving to be some of the biggest losers. Our distressed debt reporter Libby Cherry joins us now from Frankfurt for more on this story that she's been reporting on. Libby, good morning. First of all, why did these occupational pension funds invest in property?
So in the lead up to exactly this bubble bursting, we were in a very ultra low interest rate period. And a lot of these occupational pension funds have required annual returns that they need to make for the pensioners that pay into them. And suddenly in this ultra low interest rate period, buying the very safe government bonds, mortgage debt and so on was no longer providing the returns that they required. So they needed to look for slightly more arcane, higher risk products that would enable them to meet those annual returns. And if you think about how this financing was structured, it was designed for them. People were syndicating this debt out so that even very small occupational pension funds were able to invest.
So remind us then what happened when that property bubble burst.
So the kind of immediate repercussions was a lot of these developments, for example, building office buildings in major cities, residential developments, ground to a halt. The uncertainty was just so much. And also the transaction market ground to a halt as buyers and sellers suddenly couldn't agree on valuations anymore. And all of this stemmed from the very rapid increase in interest rates from the European Central Bank, which put immediate pressure on valuations and also increased financing costs. And at the same time, you also had Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the consequent increase in raw materials and so on, all of which led to a lot of these developments running out of money and basically idling, with people unwilling to invest more into these projects.
So how much pain then have these pension funds suffered as a result of this? And do we know the full extent of it? Are there further losses still expected?
So a lot of these cases are very idiosyncratic, but where we have been able to understand what's happened in these restructurings, if there are pension funds invested in this so-called mezzanine or subordinated financing, a lot of them are facing the risk of losing potentially their entire investment. A lot of the valuations of the developments were based on very optimistic views of where they'd be able to sell the property at the end of, when they finish developing it. And suddenly that value is just completely lost. And in terms of, where we might go from here, people in the market say that there are definitely more losses to come. A lot of these developments are still being restructured, still being negotiated, are in very long, drawn-out insolvency processes, and we might not see the kind of final extent of the losses, maybe for another year or so.
In the restructurings that have already happened, though, what's been the outcome for these pension funds?
So one case that we look at in particular is the first project, which is a very large development in Berlin. They actually came to London to restructure their debt. And what happened was the valuation of the property was so much lower that it had been initially envisaged when they started building, that the entirety of the debt that was sort of more junior to the more junior debt, the subordinated, the mezzanine financing, was completely wiped out, save for a small compensation payment. And that would have been very painful for those funds. We've also seen in a development in Frankfurt where there were two pension funds that were invested in the mezzanine financing, and they too were facing sort of total write-downs on their investment. But as I say, a lot of these negotiations are private. A lot of the solutions are very unique to the property. So it's hard to sort of generalize, I would say.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.